Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Joelle Toubé. I'm the Senior Communications Officer at Columbia Global Centers Paris, and I'm pleased to welcome you to our 5th annual Frankfurt and Paris Book Talk, organized in partnership with Columbia University Press. Today, we'll be discussing the newly published English translation of Lo Yichin's novel, Faraway. And we're fortunate to be joined by the translator of the book, Jeremy Tiang, as well as Kaiser Kuo, the host of Sinica Podcast. Before I hand the webinar over to Eric Schwartz, editorial director at Columbia University Press, who will introduce the speakers and the book in more detail, I'd like to make a quick note about audience participation. This is an interactive event, so if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Thank you to our panelists for joining us. Now over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Joelle. It's really great to be here again for the 5th annual Frankfurt and Paris talk. Want to thank Columbia Global Centers and Joelle and her team for partnering us with this talk, and to Christine Dunbar, who is the editor for Asian Literature and Translation, Asian Humanities, and Russian Literature and Translation, for acquiring the book Faraway, which is today's subject, and for coordinating with our speakers and Joelle to make this happen. So thank you, Christine, and everyone involved in putting this together. The Frankfurt and Paris event is our annual book talk held the Tuesday prior to the first day of the Frankfurt Book Fair, which will start tomorrow, which is the world's largest trade fair for books, inclusive pre-pandemic times of over 7,300 exhibitors, 285,000 visitors, and representing over 100 countries. The spirit of the Frankfurt Book Fair is the exchange of ideas, books, and publishing knowledge. And the spirit of Columbia Global Centers is to bring our campus to the world and the world to campus, building connections, sharing knowledge, and helping address global challenges. And this event really expresses the shared mission of global connectivity, exchange. It's what Frankfurt in Paris is all about. Bring the book fair to Columbia Global Centers and Columbia University Press. This yearly event has proved sufficiently successful that we've inspired an ongoing series, which I recommend people check out, called the Columbia Global Book Series in Conversation With. It's hosted by the director of the Global Centers, Safwan Masri. And one of our events for that series involved one of our partners in conversation today, Kaiser Kuo, who discussed the chili pepper in China with the book's author, Brian R. Dott. Safwan's book, Tunisia, an Arab Anomaly, was the first subject of the first Frankfurt and Paris event. And subsequent events have focused on Creating a Learning Society by Bruce Greenwald and Joseph Stiglitz, Vice, Crime, and Poverty by Dominique Khalifa, and American Resistance by Dana Fisher. The first 3 events occurred in Reed Hall, home of Columbia's Paris Global Center, and we've done the past 2 in a webinar format. As you all mentioned, the subject of today's talk is Faraway, a novel by Lo Yichin, and it's translated by our second conversation partner joining us today, Jeremy Tiang. The novel Faraway is a fictionalized version of which the author finds himself stranded in mainland China, attempting to bring his comatose father home. It is a powerful meditation on the nature of family and the many ways blood can both unite and divide us. Jeremy's translation captures Lo's distinctive voice, mordant wit, and a nuanced portrayal of Taiwanese culture. And according to the New York Times Book Review, Lo's language, beautifully translated by Jeremy, is a life raft in the chaos of images burned in the mind. Our 2 speakers today, Jeremy Tiang is a novelist, playwright, and translator from Chinese. His translations include novels by Yang Pui Yang, Su Wei Qian, Yan Giezheng Yuan, Lo Yichin, Chan Hokei, and Li Er. His plays include Salesman, A Dream of Red Pavilions, and translations of scripts by Chen Xian, Wei Yuqia, Hua Si Ren, and others. His novel, State of Emergency, won the Singapore Literature Prize in 2018. Originally from Singapore, he now lives in Flushing, Queens. In spring of 2022, he will be a Princeton translator in residence and a Mann International Booker Judge. Their Twitter handle is @Jeremy Tiang. Kaiser Kuo, our second speaker, is co-founder of the Sinica Podcast, a weekly discussion of current affairs in China and editor-at-large of Soup China. The breadth of his interests and the depth of his knowledge is best experienced through his podcast. His recent topics include economic growth, emissions targets, labor unrest, global engagement, and what he calls China's Red New Deal, just to name a few. He was a pioneer musician in the bands Tang Dynasty, Spring and Autumn, and Dirty Deeds, and his Twitter handle is @Kaiser Kuo. I now turn things over to Kaiser and Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. And thanks also to Joelle and to Christine and all the good folks at Columbia Global Centers and Columbia University Press. So Jeremy, let's start off with a bit about translating before we dive into the novel Faraway. It's good. I'm really glad to be paired with you. It's nice to not be the only long-haired Asian male in a room, but good to see you. I've got a bunch of friends who work as translators, and one of the things they say, probably out of modesty, is that the real work that a translator does is mostly down at the sentence level, where you spend most of your time wrestling with how to capture voice or the nuances of dialect or tone or style. But reading your translation, and really any translation by a really competent Chinese to English translator, I can't help but think that this sells short the creative element in translation. What's your take on this?
I think there is a micro and macro level to translation. And what you're describing is definitely true at the micro level, where you are working at the level of the sentence, you are working at the level of craft in capturing the voice. But there's also a larger picture that you have to put the book into, and that's the context, what context you're situating it within, and how that context changes, or rather how the book changes when you remove it from its context and put it in another. So that's the consideration of what does or doesn't resonate with an English-speaking reader, what might land differently than with its original Taiwanese audience. And those are also considerations. So it's not just about producing the most beautiful sentences, or capturing the author's voice, although those are also very important. But it's about seeing the book as a whole and seeing what role it plays in the literary culture it comes from, and drawing a line from that to the target culture, the target language, and trying to bring it across in as whole a form as possible.
So if that context is missing, if it's somehow absent in the original text, do you ever feel it's your responsibility to actually introduce sentences that aren't in, just for introducing that appropriate context?
I mean, sometimes it does have to happen, particularly in a book like Faraway, which has a nostalgic dimension to it.
Right.
There's a lot of the author reminiscing about his childhood, about the early days of Taiwan, but his own father's early life. And about how both mainland China and Taiwan have changed in the intervening decades. And some things I had to research, but they were also things that probably most Taiwanese readers would be familiar with. And so Loiqian didn't need to spell them out, but in English translation, a little more context I thought would be helpful for some readers. And then it becomes a game of doing so unobtrusively. It's really a type of inception. You try to plant the knowledge in as unobtrusive a way as you can. So for the reader, it's like they've always had this knowledge.
Right. No, that's very well put. Jeremy, you have a background in theater, as Eric just said in the introduction to you, not only as a playwright, but also as an actor. Acting always strikes me as a form of translation, and certainly no one would gainsay the idea that acting is creative and not merely interpretive, right? So as an actor, do you feel like that analogy holds, that what you were doing is creative in the way that what an actor does with a playwright's text is
Absolutely.
creative?
In fact, it's a very exact analogy, which is why acting is my go-to metaphor for the translation process. I mean, both literary translation and acting are interpretive arts. You are basing your own performance or your own rendition of the text on an existing work of art. So you're not starting with the blank page, you're not starting with the empty page, but you're drawing from someone who has already created a work of art. Yet no one, when I was an actor, no one ever said to me, but how is this creative? You're just saying the words that the playwright has given you. In the same way that I have heard, how is literary translation creative, when you're just transforming the words that have already been written? And the answer is that the creativity is in the interpretation that inevitably has to happen when you move an artwork from one form to another.
Absolutely. With your background as a playwright, do you feel like you maybe have a leg up when it comes to handling the translation of dialogue in particular? You seem to have just an excellent ear for it. That dialogue sounded very, very natural.
It could be that. It could also be that I'm a writer myself and am in the habit of, one of those people who goes around with a notebook and jots down interesting things people say on the subway. So I think anyone working with writing should cultivate an ear for dialogue, because people speak in such interesting and original ways. Right. And having the breadth of human expression as much as you possibly can does enrich what you're able to bring to the dialogue of your characters, whether that's original writing or translation, so that everyone doesn't end up sounding like you.
Right. I've always found that that's one of the really vexing things about translating from Chinese, is that you want to be able to capture the socioeconomic differences, the backgrounds, what does somebody from an educated urban northern background sound versus somebody from, say, a poor rural southern background. And in English, we all know how to handle that. We know how to do it, but it's more difficult when you're translating out of Chinese, I find. So when I read a translator like William Weaver or somebody like him, I have this sneaking suspicion that were I actually fluent in Italian, and I assure you I am not, I might actually be disappointed with the original, having read such a skillful translation by somebody with such obvious writing chops. What do you do with this temptation to improve a text? Do you ever find yourself saying, I think I could do this and it will sound, yes, a little bit better than the original, but do you give yourself license, or maybe relative to other translators that you've encountered, do you feel like you give yourself more license to do that?
I don't think of it as improving, because in a way, improving implies making it better, but there's no metric for better. You're comparing apples and oranges.
Well,
how would you say, the Chinese version is better or the English version is better? They're just completely different beasts. So I think that the Chinese original is the best version of the text that the author was able to produce in the language they were working in the same way that my job is to produce the best possible version of the text in the English language, which is the language I work in. And it's more a question of transformation. It just has to be as good as possible, but I'm not improving it. I'm just bringing it to the highest possible level that I can in this language, in this rendition.
Fantastic. Jeremy, your translation I found was really outstanding. It had this quality of fluency, but not to the point where it was no longer believable as a faithful rendering of original Chinese. You found what I thought was a really enviable sweet spot where it never felt labored, or it never felt just mechanistically translated. And yet somehow I felt like I could still hear the Chinese behind it. Is that something that you think about when you translate? Do you feel any obligation, for example, to stay tethered to the Chineseness of a particular expression? Let's say you're confronted with a Chinese idiom. Chinese is a highly idiomatic language, and it's got embedded allusions to some historical event or personage or something specifically Chinese. Would you render that ever as something, say, equally idiomatic, but with a totally different set of references in another culture? What would you do? How do you fidelity to the Chineseness of a text? How do you?
I might do either. As you might know, there's a big debate in the translation community over domestication versus foreignization. Should you create a text that reads as if it was written in English, or should you create a text that was obviously not written in English? And I think most translators exist on the spectrum between these two poles. and few stake out a consistent position. Certainly, I find that different texts have different requirements. And even within a single text, as you say, one metaphor might be crying out to be translated literally because it's so vivid and rich and its meaning is obvious once the image is put out there, while another has such a brilliant English equivalent that it would be a crime not to use it and so tap into those associations. So really, it's case by case. And rather than having a consistent dogmatic, oh, this is how I do it. It's more with each thing you come to, each sentence, each image, each expression, you think, well, what's the best strategy to tackle this thing? And I think it is this variety of strategies that keep the text alive. And that's why translation is an art.
And it's a variety of strategies within a specific text. From sentence to sentence, you might change strategies, you say. Or would it depend maybe on the author? I mean, let's get to Luo Yijun. He is obviously a very cosmopolitan writer. I mean, he is somebody who I sense maybe would have gone with domestication over or sort of exoticization or foreignization. I mean, he would be very comfortable with seeing his text rendered in very idiomatic English. My guess. Wouldn't mind seeing the sort of Chineseness stripped out of it. But you're consistent. You're not consistent within one novel. Say you will switch strategies midstream.
Well, I mean, yes, I do then do quite a lot of editing, and then my editor will look at it, and there'll be a lot of is this too inconsistent? You know, you do then go through it and see what you've put together, and does it hang together as a whole? But with reference to Luo Yijun, I would say he's an extremely Taiwanese writer. His work, cosmopolitan as it is also permeated with his Taiwanese background and the Taiwanese milieu he exists within. So I wouldn't want to, and don't actually think I could take out the Taiwanese-ness of this text. Just because I'm not translating every expression literally, doesn't mean that I'm making it less Taiwanese. Okay. And I think that actually still does come across, I hope.
So I wanted to ask you specifically about Luo and who he is. And maybe let's start with that. You talked about him existing with his a Taiwanese milieu. Let's talk specifically about the kind of Taiwanese hierarchy of letters, the writerly milieu in Taiwan, and where he fits in that. What is that world like? And what position does Luo occupy there?
So with the caveat that I'm not Taiwanese, so I'm very much an outsider to this world, my observation is that he is very high up in the world of Taiwanese letters. He's a very well-regarded author who has won a number of awards and represented Taiwan at various international residencies and so forth. In fact, we were both on the international writing program at the University of Iowa, although in different years. But the Taiwanese writer who was there when I was like, oh yeah, Luo Yijun was there here a few years ago. So it's this sense of a smallish world. I mean, it's, you know, a fairly small community. And within that, he has been so prolific and his voice is so distinctive and has been so influential that he does occupy a prominent position within it.
Is there a lot of crossflow between the Taiwanese world of letters and the broader Sinophone world, especially mainland China?
A lot of crossflow. I mean, there is crossflow. Luo Yijun's work has been published in simplified Chinese editions. It kind of doesn't help that they use different scripts, and so publication between places isn't always the easiest. But also it's just asymmetrical. When you look at, you know, a country of, what is it, 1.2 billion people, and a country of, I think, 20 million, I think, for Taiwan.
24,
yeah. Okay. I'm glad you know these things because I don't.
Sorry.
But it's, it's imbalance. It's never going to be an equal exchange. And so, yes, there is, but I would say Taiwanese writers are probably much more aware of what's happening in mainland China than the other way around.
Okay, because my sense was always that Taiwan would probably punch above its weight in letters. Like, I don't know how popular the popular mainland writers are in Taiwan. I mean, when I have conversations with Taiwanese friends, they don't talk to me about mainland books, whereas I find a lot of mainlanders really know quite a bit about Taiwan. And it's interesting. It's I imagine, yeah, it must be. Even to punch above its weight wouldn't be hard for Taiwan, right? I mean, because it is relatively so tiny. I mean, smaller than the population of Shanghai. It's not uncommon, I think, for literary translators to have personal relationships with the authors whose works they translate. Was that the case with you and Lloyd? I mean, I know that you occupied a space in Iowa that he had vacated some years prior, but did you get to be friends at some point?
We've only met once, unfortunately.
Oh.
I went to Taipei and met him, and that was nice. And we got to have a conversation. But since then, it's just been emails. So I'd say we were friendly, and I hope to meet him again in the future and continue to build our relationship. But it's quite hard to become friends at such a distance.
Yeah.
Though I do feel close to him, I think, through having worked so intimately on his text and through having had conversations online about the translation process and just being in touch with him. So yeah, we've got a good relationship.
Yeah, good. I mean, so while you were working on this text, you did then reach out pretty frequently, back and forth quite a bit about, I mean, what sorts of things that you asked him, when you encountered something that was ambiguous or difficult, or that you didn't understand, maybe a cultural reference to, or what sorts of issues did you encounter?
It was mostly about the text itself. There were some things that were in quotation marks, but I couldn't identify what they were a quote from. So I had to ask him. Some lines were bolded, and I wasn't sure why they were bolded. So it was just things like that didn't have an immediate explanation, and there was no easy way to look them up. But also I was just in touch with him just to say, yes, it's going well. Oh, here's what the cover looks like. I hope you like it. Just letting him know how the process was going.
And is his English at a level where he could evaluate your translations, where he had a sense of this is good or this doesn't quite capture? How is his English?
I don't actually know, because we speak in Chinese. And he didn't comment on my translation, which I shared with him. I don't know if that was because he couldn't read it or because he was choosing not to. But yeah, I don't know. He lives in Taiwan, so he wouldn't have much opportunity to practice his English.
I see. So I might be a little out of date. I mean, it's been a very long time since I took it in English or a comp lit class, but the last time I checked, the professors in those departments were not thrilled with this idea that as a reader, we should be thinking at all about authorial intent, and instead we should just read the damn text. How did you handle this whole issue of motive or intention or meaning? Did you ever feel compelled to ask Loa, what did you mean by this? What was your intention here?
Sometimes, but I'm actually also a big believer in the text should stand on its own terms. So I would also ask a Taiwanese friend, what does this sentence mean to you? If you read this, what would you think? Does this strike you as, should it be funny or not? Do you think it's funny? Because I think you're right. I think if the author intends something to be, say, a humorous line, then I might translate it that way. But on the other hand, if it wasn't read as a humorous line in the original, despite his intentions, then it's that thing of, do you try to carry out what the author intended, or do you do what's actually on the page?
So I'll confess that part of the reason that I wanted to suss out the depth of your relationship with him was I wanted to gauge how how critical I could be about this text, because I'll confess right off that I did have some trouble with this. It was difficult, and I enjoyed it. I think knowing that we were going to be having this conversation, before I even started reading it, I focused more maybe on the craft of translation and not as much on the underlying text as literature. But let's talk a little bit about this book, because Faraway was written 21 years ago or so. And it is a lightly fictionalized autobiography, as Eric said in the introduction there, a work of autofiction. And I think a lot of readers of English are going to be familiar with examples of this genre. I mean, Philip Roth did this in several books that he wrote. I know people have mixed feelings about him. Richard Powers, who's been very popular recently, in an earlier novel he wrote in the mid-90s, he did this. He had a character named Richard Powers who was him and was very much not him. But those were less unambiguous. They were clearly fiction. More recently, we have Karl Ove Knausgaard, right? This whole Knausgaard series, which is My Struggle, which is very, very popular. But Law, as you point out, draws on this Japanese literary style. You wrote this fantastic essay, which I'm very glad to have stumbled on, because it really kind of helped me to understand him better. It's called, the genre that he sort of belongs to is Shisho Setsu, or the I novel in Japan, 私小说 in Chinese. And maybe you could explain what that is and how it differs from some of the other autofiction that we might be more familiar with in the West, and why you classify him in this genre.
I mean, he has said that he works in this genre, and specifically that Kenzaburo Ui is an influence on him. And both of these writers, Ui and Lo, seek to subvert the Shisho Setsu genre. So in other words, to write fiction that is based on their lives, but also is not based on their lives, to blur the line between fact and fiction. Whereas the original Shisho Setsu genre was about, I guess, delving deep into one particular moment in the narrator's life and committing that to paper. It's sometimes translated as I novel, and Columbia also recently published Minae Mizumura's an I novel, which was an example, a more heterodox example of this genre, in that it's what appears to be a fairly faithful rendering of 24 hours in her life. Whereas Lo Ichin, I think, particularly in something like Faraway, is toying with the fallibility of memory and even experience. So he's presenting something that seems true, but also at certain times you think, well, is that actually what happened? Did it happen quite like that? Are you exaggerating? Are you changing the facts to make things fit together better? And he has acknowledged in other works that he does this freely. He takes life and then he passes it through the filter of his artistry until it's a distorted, an aestheticized version of real life. And that's his version of the Shisho Setsu, or autofiction, if you will. And he works by a process of collage. So he will take an element of his life, a story he's heard, something he's read, and then put it together, curate it, as it were, and shape it into a book.
He is, as you say, often toying with us. I mean, I feel like he's messing with us when he, for example, denies that what he's written is an I novel. I mean, in your essay, you actually talk about having asked him directly, did this happen? There's a really disturbing passage where, the author does not come out, the author or this character named Lo Yijun doesn't come off well. And you asked him, did this happen? And he said,
he looked me in the eye and said, I don't remember. He did tell me 90% of the book is true and 10% is fiction. But he's no longer sure which the fictional bits are, which I sort of buy, in that A, it was 20 years ago, and B, I think by writing out an account that isn't the truth, it becomes, in a way, your truth. I think we've all had this experience, right, of telling a story and having a story that you've told multiple times. And then on the 10th time, someone who is actually there goes, no, that's not what happened. It wasn't Christmas, it was Thanksgiving,
Right.
or whatever. And I think that does happen. Like, we tell a story over and over until we become convinced that our version of the story is what actually happened. But actually it has shifted. And he's just shortcutting that process, or maybe making it more deliberate.
That's very well put. There's this concept in Chinese. There's this Chinese phrase, 半真不假. It literally means half true and not false. It's always kind of set me off. I guess I'm kind of not a very epistemically flexible person, but anyway, this approach makes it, both for as a reader, both very fun and very frustrating. And the fun part is that the prose can take on this amazing specificity that seems like it could only have come from direct and quite recent observation. So throughout this novel, he is, as he's waiting taking care of his comatose father in this hospital in the city Zhejiang in Jiangxi province, where my brother-in-law is from. In fact, that's interesting. He's writing every night on this onion skin hotel paper. We've all seen that kind of hotel paper in Chinese hotels, in the coffee shop. And I feel like what we're channeling that directly. There's such stuff that's so meticulously observed that it could only have been from a contemporaneous or near contemporaneous account. But on the other hand, it's frustrating because when something rubs you very wrong, you don't know whether you can attribute these things, whether you can attach them to the author or to this character who happens to have the author's name. And it feels like a bit of a cheat, like he gets to have it both ways. There's this kind of Schrodinger's character about this, right? Did that bother you at all? It doesn't. Maybe you're accustomed to do this and maybe you take pleasure in it.
I mean, I kind of feel that you can never fully know another person anyway. We only ever see one aspect of someone else. We see the aspect they choose to show us or what they happen to reveal to us. And so he's showing an aspect of himself that might be partly real, might be fabricated. And I think to him it doesn't matter. And I suppose maybe it doesn't. Like, for all purposes, for the duration of the book, the version of Lo Yichen you're reading about is the only Lo Yichen you have access to. So that can be your Lo Yichen for the duration. And the Lo Yichen or Lo Yichen that you get from book to book differs a tiny bit. And I enjoy that. I enjoy discovering these slightly different versions of him, these slightly different voices that he's found that are all him or based on him. And I think it enriches the storytelling. I feel like even if he were to take the opposite tact and present scrupulously faithful or truthful renderings of these encounters in his life, there would still be moments when they diverge from what actually happened, because our perspective on the world and our memory of it is incredibly fallible. So why does it make a difference if he's doing it on purpose or if he's genuinely remembered something differently to how it actually was?
Well, it makes a difference for me because of this, in this novel in particular, is that one thing that I found about this novel is that the author or the character, the narrator, whether it's the author or this kind of simulacrum of the author, seems to impute no interiority to any other character in the novel. It's extremely, and I don't, this is what I want to know. I want to know whether it is deliberately so or whether he just simply doesn't have the sort of acuity or the empathy to think his way into their heads, because none of them, no, not a single, not his father, not his mother, not his wife, not his half brother, not any of the people he encounters in Zhejiang. It's almost like he's a solipsist. And I don't know whether it is Law the character or Law the author who is this solipsist. And I mean, if he is doing it deliberately, he's done it masterfully well and really consistently. But there's this thing about him where everything is intermediated by his own literary experience, right? Rather than him feeling these emotions directly. It's I don't know if it's an attribute of the character or the author. Did you feel that frustration at all?
I didn't feel it as a frustration. I think he would probably say that our own subjectivity is the only subjectivity we have access to. And if he's attempting to capture a version of his experience, then he only really has his own interiority to draw from. And if he were to give us access to someone else's what's happening inside their heads, that would have to be fictional. You'd know that was fabricated, right? Because he can only tell you what's going on in his own head, as any of us can.
Well, he could couch it as a surmise. He could have a dialogue with himself. Was this person thinking this, or was he thinking that? Was he motivated by this? Was he? I mean, that isn't there at all. And
sorry.
No, please.
Well, there are moments of that. When he writes about giving a bribe to one of the doctors at the hospital, for instance, he is focused very much on his own feelings of shame and guilt and resentment.
That's right.
But he also wonders what's going through the doctor's mind. And he does think, well, is the doctor going to go brag about this? Is he going to go home and tell his wife and kids, hey, I got another bribe today? Or is he as ashamed as I am? And is he going to keep this under lock and key? So there is that kind of what is happening and the acknowledgement that he has no idea.
So it's funny that you seized on that, because that's exactly a moment that I wanted to talk about, where I thought that's exactly when he doesn't extend that capacity for empathy. I mean, I felt like, because he bribes the doctor a few times and he's clearly uncomfortable with these interactions. The doctor is, you can see him, you can imagine easily that his professional ethics and the whole sort of power dimension of it, the Taiwan, the fact that this guy is so free with cash. He's got all these $100 bills in his pocket and he can just sort of dispense them. I don't feel like he thought his way into this man's head at a moment where that would have been interesting. I mean, he's self-aware, but only in a kind of navel-gazy way where he seems, again, oblivious. But I want we can leave off, because I wanted to be charitable and say that this is probably a deliberate attribute of this character, or maybe, as you say, that philosophically he simply doesn't believe that you can access that. You only have your own subjectivity to play with, which is a fair approach, I suppose. What about this thing though, where he drops all these names of very, very trendy writers constantly? And I should say that this is not unique to Taiwanese writers at all. It's so many of the mainland writers. I thought that was interesting, but I didn't feel like he could go 2 pages without name dropping Italo Calvino or Borges, or of course, like Gabriel Garcia Marquez constantly. And he even went so far as to take a story about a man navigating a bizarre labyrinthine bureaucracy and do something so on the nose as bringing up Kafka. I felt like it didn't have to do that. Everyone was there with you. Anyone who would have bothered to read this book knows what you're getting at. And it's like, yeah, ruin it when you have to be so quite on the nose about it. I thought that might have been just satire, but I wasn't sure what he was doing with that. Did you get a sense for that? And what is it with that? Is it a thing in Sinophone writers that they have to legitimize or validate themselves by constantly name dropping these trendy Western writers?
I don't really think it's about validation. I think it's about intertextuality. I think it's about him reading a lot and thinking a lot about literature, and maybe self-consciously charting a course between all these influences on his own writing and making them explicit. It feels like he wants to be in conversation with all these writers, and if something about the story he's telling reminds him of Calvino, then he is going to tell us that and quote from whatever Calvino book this puts him in mind of.
You didn't feel like it would have been maybe more powerful to let us do that? I mean, to make the intertextuality less explicit.
I mean, I don't know what set of references the Taiwanese audience, the Taiwanese readership of the time would have had. And it's possible that he thought that if not as many people had read Calvino, then he might need to point them out, maybe lead them to Calvino. I also don't know what got translated when, because the set of references for non-Sinophone work would have to be restricted to what had been translated into Chinese.
That's fair, very fair, yeah. So, although I wonder though, if he were referring to a non-translated work, whether that would have been even less meaningful and would have appeared only more as just sort of an attempt to seek sort of validation in the eyes of some notional foreign audience. But anyway, there's one other thing that it reminded me an awful lot of the mainland literature that was sort of contemporary mainland literature that I've encountered, and that was this scatological fixation. I mean, we are treated to many, many pages about his father's excreta and his anatomy. And again, this is something that you see a lot in even very, very well-known prize-winning mainland Chinese writers. In China, I've heard it explained as kind of a redirection of political frustration or dissent even. I doubt it serves that function in Taiwan, though. So is it just transgression for transgression's sake? Is it, I'm not sure why it has such a place of prominence.
I think it's a salutary reminder that we are human and fallible, and that we are our flesh bodies, which are going to betray us. And I think that can be sometimes in all literatures a tendency to live in the mind. And so, like many Sinophone writers, Luo Yijun is determined to bring us back to our bodies. And the way he writes of his father's loss of dignity, I think, struck me as quite moving, even as it was horrendous and grotesque in its portrayal, because he was wrestling with his own complicated feelings about his father, and seeing his father being reduced in this way through illness, through incapacity, through his treatment by an unfeeling hospital system, brought these emotions into crisis and forced him to really consider what their relationship was and to think about his own mortality. So I think there was a point to all of this. It wasn't scatological references for their own sake. It was to push us into considering the human body, all its glory and all its failures.
I should say that, I mean, even if, that kind of transgression, whether for its own sake or not, it has a special, maybe a particular poignancy in a Chinese context, in a Confucian context, where there is usually some embarrassment about that, right? Where there's an unwillingness to confront that sort of corporeality of it in a lot of ways. And because it's his father, there is like this transgression of a lot of filial piety, right, in those norms as well. So yeah, I think it is interesting. I think your perspective on this is really is a very good one too. So thanks on that. Another thing about it is, I mean, okay, let me. My feeling about this character named Luo Yijun, who is that all the while that he's in Zhejiang, he has this kind of detached, kind of numb, almost sleepwalking, semi-comatose quality himself, which is interesting because his father is literally comatose. But then he returns to Taiwan, having successfully brought his father home, and he suddenly seems to be filled with such self-loathing that he starts to summon up even more, I mean, in rapid fire succession, some very, very dark episodes from this remembered past. He seems to suddenly give very free rein to his own most sort of loathsome impulses. Am I reading that right? Do you feel like that there was this real moment of transition the moment he comes back to Taiwan?
I mean, yes, but I think that might be more of a baseline for him. As you say, we see him in crisis for most of the novel because he's so focused on dealing with his father's collapse and his father's condition, and struggling for almost a month just to get his father brought home to Taiwan. And he doesn't have energy or mental space for anything else. And then once that's finally dealt with, once he's finally managed to bring his father home, his father is still comatose. He's still in a hospital in Taipei, and Lo Jun has to bring his son there to visit his grandfather, still knowing that he's probably going to die soon, and just trying to process that, while at the same time his wife has just given birth to his second son. So that's a lot to deal with. His own fatherhood, the sense that he's becoming his father in certain ways, I think that would bring a lot to the surface, and that's what he's processing in these moments.
I see. So I'm not familiar with him outside of this novel, so I didn't know. I didn't have a sense that was his baseline, that his normal state is being filled with loathing.
Aren't we all, Kaiser?
No, not all of us, but that's interesting. His afterword, I thought was really interesting. It read almost like an apology, as though he realized to some extent he had been unfair maybe to mainlanders, to the mainland. And I think that he, again, we don't know if it's he or this character, had no sense while he was in China, even though he was around people who were his blood relatives. You didn't hear him express this, "There but for the grace of God go I." Like, I know that, myself, having lived in China for a very long time, one of my sort of standard things to do is always imagine myself, what if my parents had not gone to Taiwan, if I had lived in the mainland my whole life, what would a notional other me have experienced? And I feel like he doesn't really wrestle with it. He doesn't wrestle with the history, or with the sort of the completely almost arbitrary and random luck that favored him. So he comes there as somebody of immense privilege, but I don't feel like he really wrestles with that much.
I mean, I don't know that he would think of it in those terms. And I feel like if you asked his half-brother and cousins, the family that he does have in mainland China, would you want to be Taiwanese? Would you want to switch places? I'm not sure they would jump at the opportunity. So they have just, you're widening your eyes at me, but people kind of belong to their particular contexts and don't necessarily think, oh, this is better than that. I think many of us are used to the circumstances we grew up in, and that formed us. And I was like, well, I'm very happy with the way I turned out, so I wouldn't change anything. But that doesn't mean someone else would necessarily want to switch places with me. And I think the mainland Chinese relatives seem very happy with their lots in life.
Yeah, I mean, I really am sensitive to this because, of course, my parents lived in Taiwan before they moved to the U.S. They're from the mainland originally. They're Weishengren, just like Laura's father is. And I actually had kind of a situation kind of in reverse. My father was living in Beijing, when on a trip to Taiwan, he took ill, and he ended up having to stay for many months in a hospital in Taipei. In fact, the same hospital where his father ends up, in Rongzong Yiyuan. So I was the one, navigating the Taiwan bureaucracy, which I have to say is kind of lovely and should be a model for all medical care the world over, because it's fantastic. Rongzong Yiyuan was great, but so I sort of had the situation in reverse, and so I was very keen. I was very, very acutely aware of the big differences, and maybe that's why I feel that they were so much more pronounced. The difference between taking sick in a mainland hospital in a third or fourth tier city in the 1990s and taking ill in Taiwan in the 2010s is night and day. And yes. I guess I was just sort of, constantly making that comparison. Jeremy, let's spend the last 10 minutes here. First of all, thank you. I think this has been a really, really fun conversation, but I want to hear about the work that you're doing now. What I have not had the pleasure of seeing any of your plays. A very good colleague of mine did, has seen your plays and was raving about. So I would love to see some of your, what are you working on now?
So we were actually in rehearsals for a play I'd written when the pandemic hit and we had to suspend rehearsals. So we're looking for an opportunity to bring it back to the stage, but that's being slow to happen. It's a play called Salesman, 知死, 知死 meaning death of, for those in the audience who don't speak Mandarin. And it's the story of Arthur Miller's journey to Beijing in 1983 to stage Death of a Salesman. And I've sort of turned that into a play that explores the relationship between America and China and what happens to this very American story when you take it out of its context. Is it still Death of a Salesman when it's happening in Beijing in 1983? A city in a country that at that moment had no real concept of many key ideas such as a salesman. Right. So in a way that has also been an act of translation, transposing something out of its original context. And the play is half in Chinese and half in English. So that's something that I've been continuing to develop because post-pandemic, it does feel like the script needs to shift because we're at a different place now. Right. And so, it's very hard to take something that's written for really a different world and go, okay, we're going to stage it now without some heavy reflection about, but are we in the same place or does the story need to shift a little? So that, and I'm also translating a Liu Liangcheng novel in which the main character is a donkey. So definitely look out for that.
Oh, wow, I will. So let's go back to Salesman really quickly, though. It strikes me that it just speaks volumes about the changes that China's undergone, that Willy Loman would have been almost unrecognizable as an archetype in 1983. Whereas if you went back in 2021 and staged Death of Salesman, he is immediately recognizable. It's so interesting that that a few decades of unbridled neoliberalism can do.
Yes, but Beijing in the early 80s was this whole other world because it had been cut off from everywhere else for so long, because of the Cultural Revolution, and they're just emerging from it. And through the 80s, like there's this sense of wanting to embrace the world, and it's like bring in Arthur Miller, get him to stage his most famous play. It seems like the sky's the limit and anything is possible, right? But at the same time, everyone's still very uncertain because for a long time the horizons were so narrow, and suddenly they're wide open, and there's all this color and noise and opportunity, and that's a really interesting moment to look at. That's actually the subject of another novel I recently translated, to reach out for it. The Wedding Party.
Yeah, there we go. Wedding Party.
Which is also set in Beijing in 1982. And is about a single day in the life of the Siheyuan courtyard, exploring the lives of the various denizens of this one neighborhood, or really one housing group. So yeah, I mean, these are projects that have taken me in a very different direction, but in a way it's the same imaginative leap, whether I'm trying to imagine a Taiwanese man stuck in, as you say, a third or fourth tier Chinese city in the early aughts, or the cultural life of Beijing in the early 80s. It's the artistic act, I would say, of situating your consciousness and your perspective somewhere other than where it sits in yourself, that makes translation a creative act. You're having to do this thing where you step outside of your own self and try to see the world through someone else's eyes and then reproduce that on the page.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jeremy, I see that we left some time for any questions. If anyone has any specific questions they'd like to ask, if not, I would love to talk a little bit more about your own. I'm curious how this has been received so far, whether you've gotten feedback from people in the world of Chinese letters on your translation of this, and how you feel now having completed this, and must have taken you a very long time, and you must be very proud because, as I say, it was just a masterful translation.
Well, thank you, Kaiser. I haven't heard a lot about it. I mean, it's just out. It's holding up a copy, obligatory. Do read it. And I think people are still, people don't rush out and buy books as soon as they're released. So no doubt I will hear about it in due course. The early reviews have been mostly kind and supportive. And I think they appreciate the rather unusual project that Lo is undertaking of writing about a very difficult moment in his life through the lens of fiction. And it's possibly difficult for people to have a context for this because so little Taiwanese literature has been translated into English. And it shouldn't, and I think can't, be conflated with the wider Sinophone literature or mainland Chinese literature. It's very much its own thing.
Okay.
But I don't know if people who don't read Chinese have much to compare it against,
Right.
or even within the body of Lo Yichen's work, because as I say, he has been prolific and published, I think, something like 20 books. So it's I think hard to read this book from 20 years ago and not know everything that has come since, or understand the position he occupies and form a full assessment of it.
I see.
But I do look forward to seeing what people make of this. And I do hope that there will be more translations of Lo Yichen, because I think his work is remarkable. And it is so prominent within Taiwan that really more of it should be brought into English and other languages, and shared with the wider readership.
Jeremy, let's end with giving you an opportunity to make a plug for a project that you've been involved in for a very long time with Paper Republic and their publication Pathlight, which is a compendium of translated literature from Chinese. Can you talk a little bit about that on the last minute we've got here?
Yes, I mean, there is a question actually about whether there are types or tropes of stories from China or Taiwan that spark curiosity with English publishers.
That's a good question.
That is, I don't think there is a single answer for that. It's going to be different from publisher to publisher. I think people have moved past wanting to just hear about the Cultural Revolution and are waking up to the fact that there is a huge range of stories that we have not heard in the Anglophone world from both mainland China and Taiwan, as well as Hong Kong and Macau and Singapore and Malaysia. And that it would behoove us to be receptive to these stories and see what is out there rather than looking for particular things, because there's so much room to make, there's so much distance to make up. The Chinese language, despite how many people speak it and write in it, has been, I think, underexplored in the world of translation into English. So it's more about making up ground and filling in the many, many gaps that there are, and then looking for particular things.
Well, that's a good segue into Pathlight. There we are.
Yes. So this is Pathlight, a literary journal I edit of translation from Chinese to English of short stories and poetry. We've just published our first international edition. Previously, it was published in China, in Beijing, and was therefore hard to get hold of, but it's currently published in the US, and there's an ebook version as well.
Oh, fantastic.
And yes, it's pathlightmag.com. And it's widely available. It is a lot of contemporary writing that maybe might not. It's a mixture of very established and newer writers. So some will be more familiar than others. But we do attempt to showcase the breadth of what is now happening in the Sinophone literary world.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Jeremy. It's been such a pleasure. And it was just really a great pleasure for me engaging with your work, and a privilege to be able to talk to you about it. So congratulations on the publication, and really look forward to all the great stuff that you're going to be doing down the road.
Thank you so much, Kaiser. Thanks for a really thought-provoking conversation.
Yes, thank you both. It's been such an illuminating conversation and a great introduction to Lu Yichin and the Taiwanese literary scene. And thank you so much for sharing your own work, Jeremy. We're going to have a video up on our YouTube channel in the next few days, and we'll be sure to link to all of the works that you cited as well, and to your own websites. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Sure.